right, let's begin with the newspaper headlines. And I just want us to deal with one headline today, and that is the fuel price outrage that is set to have a domino effect on almost every household in this country, because the cost of living commodities is set to go high because of the increase in the price of fuel. Let me just take you through the numbers from what we have from the service stations this morning. In Mombasa, super petrol is going for 124 shillings and 50 cents. Diesel 111. Nairobi super is going for 127 shillings and 80 cents. Diesel is going for 115 shillings. Kerosene at 97 shillings, almost hitting that 100 shilling mark for kerosene. Nakuru 128 for super petrol. For diesel 115. For kerosene 84 shillings. In Kisumu 129 for super. You'll pay 117 shillings for diesel and 99 shillings and 30 cents for kerosene. If you're in Malaba, next to the Uganda border, on the Uganda border rather, super petrol is going for 130 shillings, 118 for diesel, 100 shillings 50 cents for kerosene. In Mandera, a price of 1 litre of super petrol is going for 141 shillings and 60 cents. Those are just the numbers that ERC finally enforced from midnight last night. Let me begin with you, Dismas. All this is coming ahead of that bill, or against the backdrop of that bill, that amendment to the finance bill that is yet to be ascended to by the president. What do you think should happen? Do you think the president will sign those amendments into law?
Well, number one, it's very curious that President Kenyatta did not sign the bill into law before leaving for China. Probably that gives us an indication that he's happy with the hikes on the cost of petroleum products in Kenya.
Right.
Number two, we've been saying times above number that there's a lot of incest happening at the National Treasury. You've got all the top officials, I think up to 10 officials who are running Kenya. All of them have got some sort of relationship with IMF. Either they're on a secondment in Kenya from IMF, or they're employees of IMF, or they read from the IMF hymn book. And we know that for the longest time since IMF was established, that when they come with the prescriptions to any economy, the performance indicator is just their books. They do not serve the interest of Wanjiku. And one wonders why we've run our economy in a manner that we are now attracting IMF attention. You remember when President Kibaki was in charge, he ensured that IMF has been kept at bay. IMF were not allowed to come and start giving us policy prescriptions. Now we've run our economy in a manner that we are begging IMF to come and give us support. And you recall a few days ago, the MP for Kiminini, Honorable Didmas Baraza, indicated that Honorable Henry Rotich should be impeached because he has displayed successful failure in running our economy. I'm wondering why Didmas Baraza has gone quiet on that. Because when the economy starts bleeding, the first person who is supposed to take responsibility is the minister responsible for National Treasury, and that's Mr. Henry Rotich. And coupled with that, majority of the guys who run our National Treasury do not have families in Kenya, or if they do have family in Kenya, they're not in touch. So one wonders whether in fact Henry Rotich is aware that there is a rise in the fuel cost. He may not be aware because he's using a GK car. Now the rest of the other managers who are running our treasury, all of them are funded by taxpayers, and their families are in the US. So some of these managers will be worried about the cost of fuel in the UK and in the US. They are not in touch with the reality in Kenya. And there is no way, and historians and economists have said, you cannot tax your way to prosperity. You are supposed to address the key issues affecting our economy.
All right.
The key issues affecting our economy is mismanagement of the economy, number one. Number two, corruption. Edward Oko, times above number, year in, year out, says out of our budget, a third goes to corruption. If we are able to curb that corruption, then we will not be complaining about this.
But a lot of Kenyans have been saying this, Master, you can't blame the IMF. I mean, it's up to you as a country with your fiscal policy to make sure you stand your ground and protect your people.
Now, when you've got horrible fiscal policies, you've got horrible monetary policies, you've been unable to run your economy, then IMF will come knocking. And in fact, IMF does not come knocking. It's us who are inviting IMF. We should be asking ourselves, how was it possible that Kibaki would run this economy without IMF. How is it possible? What happened? I mean, for those 10 years, and if you speak to historians and analysts, they say that was the best time in our economy. In as much as there were wrangles around Nusumukate, but our economy grew, people were generally happy. But now you've got a treasury with a very high appetite for the commercial debt instead of going for concessional debt. And what's the result? Everything is going up. It's very interesting now to speak to folks who are closely allied to Jubilee, who've been telling us again, times above number, that the economy is doing very well. All of us should break into a dance and song. It will be very interesting to see what they're going to say about this taxation. There was even a joke on social media yesterday that probably if you've got a Jubilee card, you go to a petrol station, you'll be given a 16% discount.
Right. Mark, in some counties, Kenyans are buying kerosene at 100 shillings. I mean, there's an inevitable feeling of betrayal. What is your take on this?
The increase of the cost of fuel, to me, lacks proper thought and justification. The justification we've been told is twofold, that the IMF gave it as a requirement for us to get what is called a just-in-case loan. I don't know what just-in-case means. And two, we've been told that we need to increase our tax bracket. Now, my question is, you increase the cost of fuel, you effectively increase the cost of everything. The cost of bread, the cost of unga, the cost of even what we call a kisiagi down in Bungoma will go higher because the kisiagi most likely uses kerosene or whatever fuel it uses to run. And at the end of the day, even if it uses electricity, the fuel levy on electricity is also going to go high. So I don't quite understand why the economists would risk this, because it is going to cause inflation to the greater part of the nation. Now, that being said, and the logic of it not necessarily making sense to me, this is what I would like to tell my government. I really don't mind paying even 60% tax. I don't mind it at all. Just make sure that I have access to quality schools for my kids. Just make sure I never have to pay another hospital bill for as long as I live. Just make sure that I don't need to call my house 6 hours in advance before I arrive to avoid being carjacked. Just make sure my grandmother, who is unwell, can go to the hospital and I do not need to hold a harambe to contribute money to pay. Also, just make sure that the taxes I'm paying are not going to fund NYS 3. What am I saying? Instead of adding 16% tax on fuel, please do 100% tax on corruption. That's all we are asking for in a country. The tax on fuel is not going to raise our budget by a third. But if they fought corruption, a third of our budget will come back alive. So CS in charge of Treasury, do us a favor. Do 100% tax on corruption. Make sure all corrupt money is brought back to this country and leave our taxes alone.
Husband, let me ask you what Dismas was raising there, and that is how former retired President Mwai Kibaki dealt with these issues. I mean, we understand he had a very solid background in economics, but where is the President Kenyatta getting it so wrong?
You may want to ask yourself that if you are an economist and you have economic advice, you are far much more privileged, to respond to the advice that you're given from a position of knowledge, and probably you want to give it to Kibaki that he is an economist, and for him, it was not so much about what he was being given by his advisors as much as his understanding of the whole thing. I think that is one factor. And the second factor you may want to look at is the runaway corruption that has been witnessed, since the Jubilee government took the reins of power. I don't think Kibaki suffered as much corruption as the public perceives, and as the Auditor General has given us indications that if a third of our budget, goes to corruption, you would understand that there is nothing much that can happen. The government may not have the funds, and the only recourse to get money is to tax. And unfortunately, they are trying to hit the common mwananchi where it pinches most. And from where I see it, I think in as much as we are trying to blame the IMF, I think the IMF is actually doing a good thing. The fact that they're pushing the government to the corner basically means that they want the government to think beyond their wits.
Right.
And increasingly, we are witnessing a situation where, I mean, people are not intellectually enterprising at Treasury, because you cannot simply say that you are going to move to prosperity by taxing Kenyans more. I want to believe that IMF was probably just making sure that at the end of the day, the government moves out of its comfort zone to address the issue of taxation, to address the issue of runaway corruption, and to address the issue of the national debt that this country has. And my understanding is that there is a lot that can be done without even, taxing Kenyans more.
Yes.
And by taxing Kenyans more, we are actually getting to understand the mediocrity that we have in terms of the people who are running this economy. For the simple reason that all factors of production that we have in this country, I think fuel is at the core. It's the most critical factor of production. And the common mwananchi down there has never really been in touch with what VAT is, has never really been in touch with how an economy that is doing well is supposed to look like. But I think with this, it's going to hit people, because the cost of bread is going to go high, milk is going to go high. Folks who are using kerosene are going to suffer. Folks who are using liquid gas are going to suffer. And if the ripple effect were to be quantified, even environmental degradation is going to come in, because people will move from oil-based products in terms of energy to natural sources of energy. And I think if people sat down and they thought that 16% on fuel is the best way to go, I think these are people who just refuse to be intellectually enterprising in their thinking.
All right. Kipchumba, that initial exemption, that initial delaying of the enforcement of this for petroleum products was in 2013 to expire in 2016. And then it was, obviously because of elections, they extended for further 2 years. But for 2 years, we knew that it was going to expire on the 1st of September or on the 31st of August. Why weren't these things that Parliament were trying to look at last week through the Junaid Mohammed not done earlier, even if it's earlier this year?
Sobriety demands that when we have such a thing, from 2013, 2016, 2018, thinking and logic demands that when you have such a breaks, we are supposed to be working on the remedial measures so that when you finally unleash the terror that is 16% on fuel, there will be some soft landing for Kenyans. But to say the least is that Rotich and the team around Treasury have engaged in what we call intellectual inadequacies, as my friend will put it. There have been no innovative thinking going around there. We are too fixated in the Neolithic thinking that the only way to increase tax or revenue is to tax Kenyans more. I think there is a lot of wisdom in when we have some of these ministers being politicians and being members of parliament, so that they do not spend most of their time in exclusive member club in Nairobi, but they are in funerals and somewhere, so that they can engage with the real Wanjiku. There is a problem, Ben, when we are dealing with people who the greatest thing they have known is a traffic jam. They don't know that there is a part of this country where people go hungry, where people sleep without food for a week. That is where we are. But going back to the issue, what Rotich ought to have done before surrendering us to the problems he has surrendered us to. One, we ought to engage in what we call innovative taxation model. This taxation model where we are now cannot sustain this economy. We are now causing a lot of harm to the economy, just seeking 70 billion. We're reading from the data from the Office of the Auditor General,
yes,
we lose a third of the public money to corruption. A third, our budget now is at 3 trillion. A third of that is 1 trillion. If today Rotich was to work on innovative ways to curb corruption and government wastages, we will save 1 trillion. 1 trillion as compared to 70 billion, which will cost Kenyans, and the ripple effect of the 70 billion will cost this economy more than half a trillion. Because look at it this way, the cost of moving goods from one point to another will go up. The cost of the goods themselves will go up. What will that mean? It will mean that the end person, the consumer, will have to get a price that will be more inflated. What are we talking about? Inflation. And already we are doing all this when our market is saturated with sugar, which will last us for 3 years, which means the economy will not grow. And the other question we ask ourselves is this. We have been told our economy is growing and all manner of PR gimmicks around economics.
Yes.
What we need to address ourselves is this. Is this growth to the common mwananchi, or is it growth to the people who trade in Nairobi Securities Exchange?
Right.
That is the point we need to take home. The other thing, as a closing remark, which we need to ask ourselves, when we give people positions such as finance, treasury, finance, CS, and PS treasury, do people sit down and realize that these are positions where you have been given for purpose of being creative? You have been picked from the 50 million Kenyans because the president deems and believes that you have something extraordinary. But when the people who have been placed there think like the common mwananchi, we have no place to hide.
All right. So, would you say that Kenyans are on their own on this one?
Well, it's very clear that with the behavior of Mr. Andrew Rotich and the company, we've surrendered our sovereignty to IMF. We cannot allow our country 50 years later that we are unable to manage our economics. We are not able to manage our economy. Then you get some fellas in air-conditioned offices in New York or Washington, D.C. coming to tell us how to manage our economy. And we need to go back to history. If Kibaki was the president today or the minister responsible for finance, what would he do? If it was Tom Mboya today responsible for planning, what would he do? If it was Musalia Mudavadi responsible for finance, what would you do? Would you just shift the burden to poor Wanjiko and poor Mura because you are unable to raise resources? And as Kipchumba has indicated, and which is very rare of him to call a spade, we're in a very terrible stage. There are those guys who are running our economy that are intellectually lazy. If they needed any other revenue-raising models, it would be so easy. Right now, we have got people with properties in truckloads in Nairobi who do not pay taxation. And I know Parliament terms above number has said, let's get these people with properties to pay tax,
right.
But nobody wants to look at it because they would be opening up Pandora's box.
Yes.
And majority of the people who don't pay tax on property are in fact in positions of leadership. So what do? They say, let's squeeze the poor Wanjiku because poor Wanjiku doesn't have an alternative. All the people we are talking about who've caused this 16% hike will not feel these effects if they're still in office. So for the next 5 years, they've got no idea of the cost of petroleum.
Right.
For Rotich this morning, if he's traveling around in Nairobi, it's you and I who are paying for his fuel. I mean, it's the government of Kenya paying for that, so he doesn't feel a pinch. But if we had the people running our treasury,
yes,
being, say, members of the National Assembly and being cabinet ministers, then when they go for a funeral in Kisii, they'll actually have the opportunity of establishing that
what's really
Wanjiku is really crying. That's number one. And then
yes,
number two, whose interest is the treasury serving when they come up with these punitive measures? Are they serving IMF interests or are they serving Kenyan interests? I think that's a germane question we need to keep on asking ourselves.
All right, very quickly, I have the final thoughts on this, Mark. Is this going to be the next political frontier we're going to see? And how does it play? Because in the past, we would have seen whoever is in the opposition making a lot of noise on this, but now there's a handshake.
What is interesting is Parliament did pass a law stopping the government from effecting this, but unfortunately the law was not assented to, has not yet been assented to by the president. Now, is this going to be a political fight? I don't quite know, because the thinking of this of whoever came up with this decision in the Ministry of the Treasury is that Kenyans will do what we've done best, which is accept and move on. You know, Kenyans suffer from a form of Stockholm syndrome, where we could protest when we were being kidnapped, but a month after the slavery of the kidnap, we fall in love with our captors. So the question is, will Kenyans remain angry? Or will we now say that we love our slave masters and please pierce our ears by the door so that we can belong to you forever? That is the question. Are we going to be the victims of Stockholm Syndrome, or are Kenyans going to reach out and ask and cry freedom? So it's either accept and move on or cry freedom, Kenya.
Indeed. All right, let's leave it there. Let's leave it there for this. I mean, it is the biggest story today in the coming a couple of days or weeks, because it is going to have an effect on every household in this country. And we're talking about the decision by the Energy Regulatory Commission to effect that 16% VAT on petroleum products. It had been exempted for 2 years. That was set to expire on the 31st of August. That did expire. There were